Welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased to see you all at this second panel discussion in our transatlantic conversation series, Historians on Democracy. A special welcome again to the four colleagues, Jeremy Varon, Marion Kaplan, Till van Rahden, and Stephen Mulder, who have prepared 5-minute inputs to kick off today's discussion. And many thanks to the students and colleagues at the New School, the University of Bielefeld, the Max Weber Foundation, and the American Historical Association for their help in organizing and publicizing this event. As we stated at the outset, democracy is currently the subject of intense scholarly and public debate in the United States and around the world. With this bi-weekly discussion series, which we are now planning to run until the end of June, we want to bring together international experts working on the history and present of democracy. As we've done with our first panel on April 8th, the recording of which has been viewed over 350 times by now, the goal is to share and debate historical insights on the conditions under which democracies emerge, stabilize, and erode, and to do so on a level that is as intriguing to historical experts as it is accessible to non-specialist publics in the US and abroad. The series is also aimed at sustaining a pluralistic professional public sphere among us historians and students of history, and to facilitate the exchange of experiences and perspectives related to the short and long-term challenges and threats the second Trump administration and a rising tide of authoritarian movements across the world pose to democracy and their societies at large, and to institutions of learning in particular. The panels address the past and present of democracy with specific focuses. Today, the role of civil society will be at the center of the discussion. In the coming weeks, we will debate transatlantic alliances, democratic institutions, the rule of law, and the relationship between liberal democracy and capitalism. I'm grateful for the various thoughts and suggestions that so many of you have sent in to help us organize these panels, and we will continue to do our best to integrate as many of them as possible. So I'm really pleased that Jeremy, Marion, Till, and Stephen have agreed to give inputs on today's focus, and we have asked them to do so by reflecting on the role of civil societies in democracies with an eye on their respective fields of historical expertise. And as last time, we hope to have about half an hour for a discussion with you all after the inputs. And it would be nice if you turned on your camera and raise your electronic hand to signal that you wish to speak. So without further ado, I want to give the first word to Jeremy Varon, who is a professor of history at the New School in New York, and I'll keep these introductions very, very brief. In his work, Jeremy focuses on post-1945 US history, the global 60s, social and protest movements, as well as human rights in the so-called war on terror after 9/11. Jeremy, I give the word to you and look forward to your input.
Okay, great. Can folks hear me? And then I have about 5 minutes, you said? Okay, terrific. So I'll kick off. I'm going to begin reading from a statement and then I'll ad lib as I conclude. So here it goes. In America today, each hour brings more soul-crushing evidence that fascism is rising before our eyes. Lest you think this hyperbole, consider the closing line of a court opinion pleading with Trump's lawyers to restore due process for the hapless Venezuelan man illegally sent to El Salvador. They wrote, quote, "It is possible to see in this case an incipient crisis, but an opportunity as well. We yet cling to the hope that our good brethren in the executive branch perceive the rule of law as vital to the American ethos. This case presents their unique chance to vindicate that value while there is still time." That's a judge's polite way to say that we are fast entering the twilight of democracy. Whether there is time depends, of course, on whether the Trump presidency accepts the rule of law as a basic predicate of democracy. Things in America, to translate, are bad, very bad. Today we speak not of law, but of civil society, though the threat to each is fundamentally the same. I will first address what Trump is doing to civil society, and then what some in civil society are doing to try to save it, assuming there still is time. Trump's goal is maximalist, to use threats, bribes, theft, insults, and gross abuses of power to turn all of American life, government, trade policy, the press, the law, museums, schools, sports, the arts, entertainment, into both stewards and echoes of his dark worldview and despotic will to power. Since we last met, the assault on the university as a source of independent critical thinking has been especially severe, and I needn't rehearse the detail. Receiving less attention is this outrage, that a 35-year-old lawyer and former beauty contestant with no historical training privately complained to Trump that she didn't think exhibits at the esteemed Smithsonian museums were patriotic enough. Within days, he fired off an executive order railing against the museum's alleged bias and putting her in charge of its MAGA makeover. She will report directly to Vice President Vance to determine the content of this magnificent, sprawling museum. Such conceit, rampant in all things Trump, is juvenile, it's pathetic, but it's dangerous just the same. And then, anytime any of its measures meet criticism, we get these belligerent boilerplate, defenses of MAGA that sound like they were written by, an angry high schooler. I mean, there's something sort of tacky and unprofessional about the way they operate. It's an offense, not just to sort of morality and reason, but basic taste. In short, civil society is a major target, extending Trump's influence vastly beyond a president's normal prerogative to shape a range of policy matters. It truly is a top-down cultural revolution with all the chilling menace that implies. Each MAGA measure is met with a lawsuit, but the law cannot be counted on to rescue us. Public action, everyone agrees, is a crucial element. And here there are some faintly positive signs. People are starting to hit the streets, and more importantly, they're starting to organize, often across institutions and across sectors, for some public pushback to the MAGA assault. And then I'll conclude by talking about an initiative that I was involved in recently. And I should say that, 3 or 4 weeks ago, something in me snapped. And I realized that I could spend the next 4 years demoralized, afraid, in fear and trembling, or I could do something, however small, to, assert my agency. So I furiously began organizing for a cross-campus demonstration in New York City as part of a national day of action to defend higher education. Christina was there, thankfully, and it was a glorious crowd of 2,000 people from every kind of institution, academic workers, students, faculty, attorneys, etc., coming together in a truly unprecedented way in defense of shared interests. And then, more remarkably, today, 150 university presidents signed a letter pushing back against the assaults on universities. So you're starting to see, green shoots of hope in the form of collaborative citizen action. I should say I have no illusion, and I'll need 1 more minute, about what civil society protest alone can accomplish. First off, it's relatively weak. I'm finishing a book on protest of the Iraq War, and you had vastly greater demonstrations on behalf of a country, 7,000 miles away that Americans would mostly never visit. And then here, American democracy is under threat, and there's relatively weak public response. The second analogy is that the Iraq War didn't end because somebody realized that the moral case against it was so powerful. It ended when the whole thing collapsed in a maelstrom of chaos and death that the administration couldn't manage. So realistically, we are waiting for some major blunder, perhaps the torching of the global economy, to delegitimize the Trump presidency. And we need to sort of stand there in waiting at the ready, out of the shadows and in public light, with this articulated critique of the totality of the corruption and the moral rot and the incompetence and the despotism that it represents. And at some point, work in synergy with a more broad-based collapse of his support. Should there be any bottom to people's willingness to participate in the cult of personality and sign off on anything he does, no matter how venal. So I'm a big fan of civil society protest, but, empirically, there are limits to what the citizen voice, alone can do. And we need to continue to, build alliances within the political class, have a strong presence in media to model an overwhelming case for the preservation of democracy, hoping that the great catalytic moment where people rise up to achieve that one day comes. Thank you.
Wonderful that you keep to the 5 minutes and still knew how to say quite a lot to discuss afterwards. So I give it over to Marion next. Marion is Skirball Professor of Modern Jewish History at New York University. Her works have enriched the fields of modern European history, German Jewish and Holocaust history, as well as women's history. We look forward to your input, Marion. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. As the world churns in reaction to the Trump administration's multi-pronged attack on the American state and American democracy, I've been asked about bystanders or enablers, those in German civil society, groups and individuals who cheered or went along. Indeed, most of us have taught about individuals like Pastor Niemöller, originally a Hitler supporter, who wrote a mea culpa in 1946. First, they came for the communists, he wrote, and he did not speak up for them, and then he included the socialist, trade unionists, and Jews. So when they came for him, no one was left to speak up. Chillingly, at the New York demonstration on April 5th, I saw the sign, first they came for the Palestinians, with a photo of Mahmoud Khalil. And at an AAUP demonstration on April 17th in Foley Square in New York, another poster held the photo of Mohsen Mahdawi, another student arrested April 14th at his naturalization interview. David Myers, professor of Jewish history at UCLA, wrote that Mahdawi, who spoke to both sides at Columbia, was arrested for being a Palestinian. Other students have been arrested, and 1,500 have had their visas canceled. Reacting sharply and echoing Niemöller, M. Gessen wrote, quote, "A country that has pushed one group out of its political community will eventually push out others." So what can civil society do? Hannah Arendt, among others, commented on the lack of resistance in German civil society. She noted, quote, "The personal problem was not what our enemies did, but what our friends did." Arendt continued, "Gleichschaltung was rather voluntary, in any case not yet under the pressure of terror." Think, for example, of German students who took the initiative to burn books and harass Jewish professors and students out of classrooms, and the myriad clubs that excluded Jews even before they had to. The April boycott showed some customers with spine. Nevertheless, Jewish businesses dropped off precipitously thereafter. Importantly, the SA enforced Nazi rule, similar today to ICE among immigrants. Fear took hold in just a few weeks. What would have been necessary then, and I'd add today, was the broad opposition of civil society, never, as Arendt underlined, the work of the lone individual. She argued that only through public and collective action could meaningful political change be brought about. Recently, Cory Booker, the US Senator from New Jersey, a former Rhodes Scholar and another graduate of Yale Law School, in his marathon 25-plus hour speech in the Senate, insisted that resistance comes only when civil society stands together. Similar to Arendt, he appealed not to an individual. He hoped for a growing movement, not one action. It has to be millions of actions. Booker argued that civil society could be a space for freedom, although a vulnerable one. Recalling the women's suffrage, civil rights, and labor rights movements, Booker reminded the nation that segregationists poured hot coffee on, severely beat, and murdered civil rights activists. Referring to the present, He underlined that civil society needs to realize it has power if we are willing to get out in the streets, march, lobby, stand up for our neighbors. Since civil society is made up of its constituent parts, for today, I include in the definition of civil society not just advocacy associations, but specifically unions, universities, and lawyers. So for advocacy groups, in Germany, these groups nazified while a few dissolved. In the US, Trump's administration is threatening the tax-exempt status of many advocacy groups. Some are suing, others are lying low. Lawyers. In Germany, within 3 months, the German Bar Association succumbed to, if not facilitated, its own Gleichschaltung. In the US, 10 major law firms buckled early. 2 firms, on the other hand, took the Trump administration to court. And the ACLU seems to be working around the clock. Unions. In Germany, the Nazis outlawed and raided labor unions on May 2nd and forced workers into the Nazi-run German Labor Front. In the US, unions have sued in courts, and a new pro bono group, Rise Up, was formed by the AFL-CIO along with other unions and civil rights groups. Quote, "We are still operating as though there is a rule of law," end quote, Liz Schuler, president of the AFL-CIO, said as she sued the Trump administration. And universities. In Germany, the universities went along enthusiastically. In the US, despite student and faculty opposition, multiple universities, excluding the richest of them, Harvard, have caved. In fact, 2 of the 3 universities with the most foreign students, NYU and Columbia, caved quickly. But here's a reminder. As Harvard law professor Janine Suk-Gerson wrote, the goal is rather to bring the university as a representative of major institutions of civil society to its knees. It's not just about money. Trump and crew gain when they destroy the independence of these groups and organizations. The closing up of civic space helps all authoritarian regimes. And yet, it's up to civil society, wherever and whenever we can, to show that the emperor has no clothes. Thank you.
Thank you as well, Marion, very much for your thoughts and the input. And I hand it directly over to Till van Rahden, who is Professor of German and European Studies at the University in Montreal, Canada. He is a specialist in modern German and Jewish history and the history of democratic ideas, cultures, and experiences since the Enlightenment. We are pleased that you are with us as well, and I look forward to your input.
Yeah. Thank you so much to everyone who's making this conversation possible. When a man knows he is to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates his mind wonderfully, Samuel Johnson has noted. This is also true for contemporary conversations about democracy. As we speak, there is an urgent need for a nuanced understanding of democracy, of its core commitments, its breadth, its evolving character, its promise, what it was, what it is, and what it can be. The premise of my remarks today is that democracy as a system of government presupposes a certain way of life that is grounded in sensorial experiences of equality and freedom. By way of introduction, I would like to invoke Walt Whitman's 1872 essay, Democratic Vistas. The poet's faith in democracy offered a message of hope in a time of divisiveness and despair. To Whitman, democracy was primarily a matter of quotidian encounters. Did you too, O friends, suppose democracy was only for elections, for politics, and for a party name, he asked? And he answered, I say democracy is only of use there that it may come to its flower and fruits in manners, in the highest form of interaction between men and their beliefs, in religion, literature, colleges, and schools, democracy in all public and private life. To survive, according to Whitman, democracy needed to get, quote, as firm and as warm a hold in men's hearts, emotions, and beliefs as in their days feudalism or ecclesiasticism. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, most historians and social scientists generally assumed that democracy is the default system of government in modernity. The field of transition studies that emerged after 1989 explored how liberal democracies could be established. Once post-communist countries had embraced free elections and the rule of law, these theories presumed democracy would resemble a perpetual motion machine, a model of government that could be exported almost anywhere. If we are all Democrats now, we have lost sight of the fact that democracy is inherently fragile. Both as a system of government and as a way of life, it is more unlikely than a monarchy or dictatorship. There is no great share of probity necessary to support a monarchical or despotic government, Montesquieu noted in 1748, and I quote, "The force of laws in one and the prince's arm in the other are sufficient. But in a popular state, one spring more is necessary, namely virtue," a concept obviously that needs to be translated into slightly different vocabulary, but replace it by democratic ethos for the purpose of our conversation. So highlighting the fragility of democracy draws attention to two simple questions. What are the cultural and social preconditions of democracy? How can we strengthen and renew them? Such questions are elusive. As one surveys decades of scholarship on civic culture and civil society, many studies focus on values and a moral consensus as the foundation of democracy. The concept of democracy as a way of life, in contrast, does two things. It offers a language of weak normativity that avoids strong moral judgments, and it serves as a concept bridging the divide between the public and the private, a divide that is central to liberal democracies. Forms, not norms, are crucial here. Democratic forms of sociability emerge not from an ethical consensus, but rather from discord and strife. An ability to accept moral dilemmas that we cannot solve but only navigate presupposes forms that enable citizens to live with deep pluralism. Reflections on ways of life allow us to hone our appreciation of the cultural foundations of democracy. No matter how stable a parliamentary democracy may seem, without ways of life that allow for democratic experiences, it will perish. Democracy requires that citizens cultivate specific habits of the heart in quotidian encounters. This presupposes a democratic commons, forms and spaces such as schools and parks, municipal libraries and swimming pools that offer everyone the chance to experience freedom, equality, and perhaps even justice in a sensorial way. In short, and this is where I will end, in short, to explore democracy as a way of life is to focus less on how democracy works and more on what democracy feels like.
Bill, as well, for your thoughts and the vision you've drawn. I look forward to the final input that will be given by Stephen Mulder, who is an environmental and social movements historian based at the Rachel Crescent Center in Munich. He's currently a research fellow in the program Technology, the Environment and the Future of Europe and NYU's Remark Institute. And I welcome you as well very much. Look forward to your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks so much for organizing this, and thanks everyone for joining the discussion. Yeah, I think in the last discussion, I noticed that there was a lot of conversation about fear. And I think when we're talking about the role of civil society, there's also another feeling that comes to mind, and that's been resignation. What can we possibly do? What can individuals do? How can we do something about everything that's going on all at once? how can we even figure out where to begin when the strategy is to flood the zone and so many things are happening all at the same time. I've been thinking a lot about that, and I wanted to share some ideas based on my research about social movements and popular politics. And one of the most poignant messages that I found in the archives when I was doing research came from a woman called Freya Hoffmann, who was closely involved in efforts to stop the proliferation of nuclear energy in West Germany in the 1970s. She lived in Freiburg near the border with France and Switzerland and southwestern West Germany, and she helped to organize protests against a nuclear reactor that was going to be built in the village of Wiel, right outside of Freiburg, or 20 kilometers or so outside of Freiburg, right on the Rhine. And the protests against that project were highly successful because they brought together a really broad coalition of people, a coalition that started with local farmers and vintners who are most worried about how the steam released by the reactor's cooling tower would damage their crops. But that coalition also included people who came to be concerned about the issue of nuclear energy on account of concerns about nuclear war. They included scientists and physics students in particular from nearby Freiburg, where Hoffmann lived, who were concerned about radiation. They included French citizens from across the Rhine and Alsace who were concerned about what was happening to their region and how the river created a border over which they had no say on what was going on the other side. And it was this sort of broad coalition in which people tried to understand others' concerns and managed to make common cause, something that was at times very challenging for them to do, that enabled them to create mass protests in out-of-the-way places, to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience, to carry out a 9-month construction site occupation that became a sort of founding myth of the West German environmental movement. So the document that I referred to at the beginning that I found was an open letter about the example of Wiel, as Freya Hoffmann put it, that she sent out. And the letter had to do with resignation. She sent out a letter about a month into this 9-month occupation of the construction site. And she wrote that what happened at Wiel showed that, quote, "we are not powerless when there are many of us and when we act together." But then she continued, because she'd heard that in many other places, this example of Wiel, all of these powerful protests, had actually led to resignation. Elsewhere, she wrote, people say, "oh yes, those people at Wiel are especially brave. What they're doing would not be possible for us." And I think the message about resignation is so important for us to think about now because of what Hoffmann wrote next, which was that what she said was that those people feeling a sense of resignation didn't realize that even here at Wiel, just a few people started on their own. It took arduous efforts of persuasion to explain the dangers of nuclear power plants. Detail work was carried out patiently. Flyers were distributed, signatures were gathered, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this message is so important in a context where we need to develop a strategy to an incredibly powerful effort to do so many things, so many disruptions and changes all at once. And it's important because it reminds us, first, of how important these sorts of intensely local grassroots organizing is, how important individual conversations and concerted efforts to share ideas and find common ground are. It also reminds us that we need to understand how differently different people are affected by the changes and attacks that we're seeing now and find ways of building solidarity, making common cause, and working together. And I think it's also an important reminder that, as I read on a sign at the protests in New York City last Saturday, the cavalry are not coming. And by that, I mean that the penchant to want to find recognizable leaders, well-organized hierarchies, clearly articulated programs can cause us to overlook the real action that forms the basis for big events that can happen later on and for bottom-up change that can make a difference here. And so to discount the detail work that Hoffmann knew was so important can be a big problem for us. And so just to conclude my thoughts here, I wanted to turn from Freya Hoffmann to another 70s environmental activist, Solange Vernex, who lived in Alsace and was also involved in that same protest, as well as many other protest movements. And she saw the protests there as what she called part of a multi-strategy. At the same time as she was helping to occupy this construction site in Germany, she was campaigning for a seat in the French National Assembly. Her multi-strategy meant acting inside and outside of Parliament at once. It meant combining direct action, protests, and petition drives, flooding licensing hearings, and initiating legal challenges. And I think it's just another reminder that, the things we've heard mentioned in some of the other presentations, all of these things we need to do them together. We need to find ways to work collectively and build community and be open to so many different forms of engagement and of resistance. There's a lot to be done. We're not going to accomplish all of it today or tomorrow, but we need to start where we are and work together to make a difference here. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen, for this final of the 4 inputs. And it's wonderful to see that we have almost half an hour to really discuss and engage with all of you who've joined us on the Zoom. So whoever wants to start with a question or a comment, please raise your hand or speak. Martin Lutz. Greetings to Bielefeld. Hello.
Hi, Christina. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay,
Perfect.
excellent. Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question, I guess, both for Marion Kaplan and Jeremy. Unless I overheard something, I think you did not mention churches or other religious organizations as part of civil society. And I have 2 questions on that. First of all, did you intentionally leave out religious actors as part of civil society? That's the first question. Second question, I mean, there are some interesting historical parallels. For example, when you look at Nazi Germany, churches were part of resistance, more so pronounced in the Catholic churches, but also the Bekennende Kirche was active in protest and resistance. And in the US, you have the example of the civil rights movement where religious actors were very prominent. And the second question here is whether you see any signs that religious actors, religious organizations can play a major role in steering current protest. Thank you.
I mean, I'll answer first if that's okay. I mean, I think I left out churches inadvertently, but partly because they've been so conspicuously, silent with modest exception. I mean, Cory Booker clearly spoke out of a kind of Black prophetic tradition with religious roots. And then, of course, Trump was upbraided by that female bishop in Washington around the time of his inauguration. And then I think significantly, one of the last things the Pope did, literally the day before he died, was tell Vance that he has considerable differences over theological understandings of how you should approach sort of immigrants and the poor. So there's been some high profile voices, but so far churches aren't really a recognizable part of the resistance beyond the usual suspects of progressive evangelicals and some, radical Catholics. And then probably at the local level, people are afraid that they will divide their congregations, which inevitably will have some, MAGA kind of folks. But I wish desperately they would find, their voice. And then organized religious life has a declining presence in the United States. There's new data on withering, church attendance. And then that's something that the Christian wing of MAGA obviously wants to reverse. And there's even, creepy language about boosting birth rates that feels like, kind of Nazi natalism. Informed by a sense of, Christian virtue for women. So I think the jury is still out, as it were, on the churches, but it's an absolutely valid question.
Marion, do you want to weigh in as well?
You're muted.
You're still muted. We can't hear you, Marion. You're muted.
Okay.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
You're muted again.
All right. How's this?
Now it
Better?
works. Yes, yes, we
Oh.
can hear you.
It just popped up. The mute popped up. I don't know. I had written in my original draft about environmental advocates, ethics watchdogs, immigration protection groups, churches, even the American Bar Association. But I had to cut it all because we were supposed to do 5 minutes. As to your understanding of the churches in Nazi Germany, I would disagree. I do not think the churches did nearly enough in protecting Jews. And even the Bekennende Kirche protected converted Jews. So I'd be very careful about how great the German churches were, and I'd leave it at that.
The next question comes from Ulrike Hirschhausen. Hello. Marion, can you mute yourself, please? I think the confusion just occurred because I
Oh, I'm
muted
sorry.
you.
Does it work?
That's okay. Yes, we
Okay.
can hear you.
Thanks, Christina, for getting all of us into this conversation across the Atlantic. I just returned yesterday from a year in Cambridge, and the attack on Harvard has been all we have been seeing in the last weeks. Harvard today actually has filed a lawsuit against the new administration, arguing that the freeze of funds violate constitutional amendments. So I would be interested in hearing from our American colleagues, how do you see chances of winning a case against the administration in a time like this, as part of this civil society opposition eventually evolving?
I mean, again, I can begin if that's okay. I mean, so far, the record in courts is pretty good. You know, mostly having to do with like civil liberties, rule of law stuff. You know, though the victories often come in the form of, you know, restraining orders on a Trump policy with the underlying issues to be decided later. And then the underlying issues are vital because Congress, as you all know, has the ability to appropriate funds. And you could argue that per the Constitution, the president doesn't get to determine how those funds are, you know, spent. And yet that fundamental premise is being violated, you know, left and right. So Harvard, like in other lawsuits, is challenging like the fundamental premise of the legitimacy of the president controlling, you know, where monies go. And then, you know, the idea is that if the, you know, president can financially reward or punish people, that is the recipe for despotism. So the founders said a representative body, you know, needs to have the power of the purse. And then too little attention is being given to how violating that is the kind of predicate of, you know, a vast percentage of what Trump is doing. And then I hope that, you know, the case lasts years, you know, and provides traction through legal inertia, and then raises as a matter for public conversation, wait a second, in the first instance, do they even have, you know, the power to do this? And then that same argument is being made in other sectors with respect to, you know, the defunding of grants, other kinds of research in various federal agencies or semi-governmental agencies.
Marion, Stephen, Till, if anyone else from the panel wants to respond. Yeah, Marion, go ahead.
How's this?
Yes, we can hear you.
I just wanted to add something very brief, which is the worry that my colleagues and I have is that the courts can do all the right things, and Trump has the power. And it reminds me of that famous, maybe apocryphal statement that Stalin said, which was, how many divisions does the Pope have? That is the concern that I share with many, many of my colleagues.
Kenneth Bedford, you have the next comment or question about.
If I could speak to this issue that Ulrike raised, I would say two things. To Marion, the apt quote is from Andrew Jackson. Mr. Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision. Now let's see him enforce it. That actually is circulating inside the Trump administration. But on the issue of how effective the courts are going to be, I agree with Jeremy that initially, I think the court decisions are all going to go in the right direction. The problem is that at its normal pace, not using emergency appeals and the like, an immense amount of damage can be done before this is ultimately decided by the Supreme Court, which is where it's going to have to be decided. I think that we're going to get surprises. Jeremy quoted from the Fourth Circuit decision involving Abrego Garcia, which was written by Harvey Wilkinson III. I used to actually practice law in Richmond, Virginia, where he's from a very aristocratic family, steeped in Jim Crow, Reagan appointee, profoundly conservative, but could not go this far from a rule of law perspective. I'm not sure that there is a majority on the US Supreme Court that has that set of standards. We've seen what Alito has already written with Thomas in concurrence. It may just come down to John Roberts, and I'm not hopeful in that regard. So yes, you bring the lawsuits. That's better than making settlements and engaging in anticipatory obedience. But you do it understanding that it could be a Preußen contra Reich kind of decision in the end.
Thanks, Ken. I would like to ask a question that seeks to connect the perspective on civil society and the institutions, and most importantly, Congress. One thing that I noted that I'm not as used to in the political culture I know from Germany or Europe is that much attention here is paid to the fact that the voters need to be in touch with their members of Congress, with their senators as much as they can in order to try to force Congress to resume its role, the role it has been given to the Constitution, which at the moment seems to be kind of structurally the most fundamental problem, that this branch of the government doesn't function the way it should, as opposed to the courts for now, I guess. And maybe you can, the panel can weigh in a little bit about this, also the history of rallying members of Congress, senators from among the general public. We've seen these town halls, especially in Republican districts, that seem to be taking place. And every time you see a video, you're astonished by the critical energy that is also there by people who vote Republican usually. So do you see any, is there something that needs more attention, more direct action from among civil society, but also is this something that has worked significantly in the past? I mean, Jeremy alluded to the opposition to the Iraq War, where it didn't work, but was that done in a similar way, or is this rather recent, this appeal to get in touch with your member of Congress?
I mean, I'll say that, like, by and large, the Democrats haven't really, found their voice. And then the popularity of the party is plummeting, but that's mostly disaffected Democratic voters who think that their leaders aren't doing enough. So in a way, the first target, not adversary, but the first target has to be the Democrats themselves. And this is where Indivisible started in 2016 to try to kick up a kind of war internal to the party to push for greater resistance to Trump. And then, Senator Holland has been fantastic visiting El Salvador. Senator Murphy's been great, sort of the usual suspects, in the House. But, Schumer has kind of failed to boldly leave. And there is talk of primarying, quote unquote, ineffective Democrats, which would probably be, a good thing. And then, realistically, what we have to hope for is a Democratic landslide in the midterms. And then they're in control of all the committees, can impeach Trump as warranted, and then function as, friction to at least decelerate his agenda. And something like that happened in the first term. And then, I hate to place our agency in, the Beltway, but we need real institutional power, not just like passion and signs in the streets. And I should say that at the A17 rally, I talked to Khalil's main attorney. And I said, gee, I think at the end of the day, he's going to be deported. And he kind of shook his head and said, you're probably right. And I said, and at the end of the day, we need to, win back the House in 2 years and see where that takes us. And he says, I think you're probably right. And this is a guy, deeply skeptical about institutional, Washington. But the Democrats have a vital role to play as an actual opposition. And the Harris campaign warned us, but concerns with democracy didn't poll terribly well because it was about the price of eggs and, illegal alien, murderers. But we all lose if the foundations of democracy are destroyed. That truly is game over. And I hope that they learn that lesson, very, very, very quickly.
Stephen, maybe do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. Yeah, I think those are all good points, but I just wanted to add, especially when we're thinking about civil society, I think Jeremy's making great points that, you need institutional power as well. But I think one problem that we can quickly run into is if we sort of focus too much on Trump alone, because these things are not solely that are happening now are not solely because of Donald Trump, and I think that the changes that we're going to need to see in society to try to stop this and prevent more things like it from happening are about more than just Donald Trump, but that's about more than just institutional power. As important as that is, it's also about trying to get, a more engaged society that cares more about democracy. And that's not necessarily just from listening to Kamala Harris talk about it, but from kind of living that on the street. Maybe that has some connection with some of the things that Till was talking about, also democracy as a way of life. But I just kind of wanted to emphasize that we need to think in the broadest possible terms. And of course, it will be important to have a real opposition in Congress, but it also is very important for people to be doing something beyond that.
Also, weigh in. How do you reconcile kind of the way of life approach, which is non-activist, non-protest, but rather, meditative, deliberative, emotional? How do you make sense of a moment like this where one issue is what's the issue we're actually fighting for or against, right? If you look at the anti-war Iraq war protest, there was one clear issue around which you could rarely hear. The interesting thing also seems to be that all these different sides have very diverse yet kind of connected messages, but it's democracy at the end of the day is a very abstract concept, I guess, and people have various conceptions of democracy, and the way you describe it, and you've written about it, is rather contemplative. It's a contemplative culture of democracy that nowadays seems to be totally out of touch with what is needed in order to save the structures of however flawed this democracy, of this democracy, however flawed it is. What would you respond to that?
Well, I'm not arguing against taking to the streets and demonstrating against specific measures or using the courts or any means available to challenge the current policies of the Trump administration. But I think there's something that we need, as scholars, need to acknowledge, and that is the depth of the disenchantment with American democracy among the broader electorate, right? It's a fact that more than half of the people who voted for the MAGA presidency, in some ways knowing what they were voting for. So I think in order to understand that kind of disenchantment, we need to take a slightly longer view and understand at which moments a kind of robust democratic culture would have served as a counterweight against authoritarian tendencies of any kind. But I think so. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think it's also important in this context, and I think that's particularly important for a sort of German/European perspective on current events. Nativism, racism, xenophobia are also as American as apple pie. This kind of robust democratic pragmatism that I find appealing is one part of an American political legacy that I think is worth re-evaluating, recuperating, revisiting. But there's also a very sort of quote unquote rich tradition that pulls in a very different direction. When Leonard Cohen says the United States is the cradle of the best and the worst, as we start thinking about modern democracy, I think he makes a very important point. And if we ignore the fact that it's also about the worst, we miss something that is relevant for our conversations, that is not just about what are we going to do in the next 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 months, or maybe 2 or 3 years, but how do we step back and understand, offer an explanation of whatever kind for this very far-reaching disenchantment with representative democracy, liberal democracy, pluralist democracy, whatever label we want to use to specify that, when we think about things like the rule of law, checks and balances, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, let me add here that
Yeah.
sort of conspicuous in its absence has been discussions of, the economy. And I think that decline of, faith in democracy is connected to decades-long frustrations with the economy. And then my understanding is that during Weimar, so many people, rejected democracy because it seemed inefficient. It was an effete debating society. It was chaotic. It didn't accomplish anything. And then, the Nazis, part of their appeal was that they can get things done. And then think of Trump saying, I alone can fix this, and name the problem: immigration, unfair trade policy, real declining wages, stupid wars, etc. So like an effective progressive counterweight can't just be trying to reanimate people's sense of civic consciousness. They need to demonstrate that government can, deliver on the kitchen table and structural economic issues that matter, so dearly to people. And then this is why AOC and Bernie, somebody mentioned in the chat, it's so important to, pluck on the sort of strings of a kind of, left populism that will deliver improvements in quality of life, not just convince people of, the sort of moral and collective virtues of, genuine democratic, citizenship. And then the white supremacy and the nativism was always opposed to democracy, right? The 3 biggest threats to American democracy historically were the slave states who didn't want to join a constitutional order, then the insurrection that was the Civil War, then Jim Crow that wanted to deny democracy in the South, and then arguably, January 6th, which was a white supremacist effort to dispense with democracy, altogether. But, the more people see that democracy can work, the greater affection they might have for it.
If there's any final comment or question from all of you, weigh in at this moment. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up in a few minutes. Marion.
I wanted to raise a couple of things. I just wanted to pull together some things. Till, you mentioned morality, moral dilemmas. And I'm thinking that connects totally to what Jeremy just said. It's about capitalism. Paul Weiss earned 34% more in 2024 than it earned in 2023. It earned billions more. They could have taken a cut. They didn't. Brett Karp, the president of the chairman of Paul Weiss, flew to see Trump in his private airplane. These are people who have put money before democracy and money before any kind of negative reaction to what the Trumps are doing. The second thing I want to say is that my African American friends think this is a gigantic attack on the civil rights acts of 64, 65, which it is. There's no way around it. And it's not just an attack on the law, it's an attack on a culture of acceptance, a culture of equality. So I think that's super important as well. And then the third thing was this issue of fear, which I brought up and then others brought up too. You may have all seen what the senator from Alaska spoke about, Murkowski, the other day, that everyone's afraid. The Republicans are afraid. They're not just afraid of being primaried, which seems to be the argument they always give. They're afraid of being shot at. And you may have noticed that Trump said nothing about when Josh Stein's house was, put on fire. So I think that those are important aspects to keep in mind. And I go back to what I said earlier. Who is going to be able to enforce what the Supreme Court says if by luck and chance they were to come down on the right side of the law? That's all I want to say.
Phil just raised his hand, so maybe we can take one more comment from you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we
Great.
can hear you.
I just want, so I'm English. We had our battles over the last 5 years. Nothing like this. We're facing the prospect of something just as bad, I think, over the next 4 or 5 years. And the big issue seems to me to be that the left is doubling down within itself and consolidating its sense of injustice. And the history of democracy, for the most part, looks pretty certain that as soon as you begin to split a kind of the radical left from the liberal and the middle of the road centre, you end up with major problems for radical goals. So I think one question to ask is how, picks up on Till's suggestion in many respects, how you branch out from the core, how you reach out to churches, to veterans associations, to rural communities, to unions, how you change the structure of social media to communicate in a different way than is currently being done. How you find alternative ways of living with people who you've got to get on your side. So thinking horizontally about how you make those kind of connections might be just as important as thinking legalistically or combatively about how you challenge particular kinds of decisions.
Sure, Mark. I saw a lot of nodding on the part of the panelists, and I will just keep our promise to keep it to an hour. And if you would agree and be fine with that, leave it at that. We've just posted again the list of themes and dates that we are planning until the end of June. And as you will see, the final panel will take up the question of the liberal democracy or democracy and capitalism. It is a fundamental one. And I look forward to continuing the conversation and this thought-provoking tradition now with this series. Until then, the approach is not to have answers, but to pose good questions and hear intelligent, engaging thoughts and considerations with a perspective that is informed by history. So thank you so much to the four input speakers today, and to all of you for joining us. We will be in touch. Please do find us wherever you follow social media, Blue Sky, Instagram. There's a newsletter, and reach out personally if you want to. And take care, be safe, and stay engaged. Bye-bye. Auf Wiedersehen. See you soon.